I'm Reverend Patricia Adams-Farmer, pastor of Millersburg Christian Church, and the title of my sermon today is Overcoming Evil, a More Excellent Way, Romans 12, verses 9 through 21. Have you ever felt that you were on the outside looking in, socially, politically, even among family and friends? Maybe our beliefs are strange, or we simply don't fit in, or there is an enormous pressure to conform. The early Christians felt that way, and they suffered much. Now, in today's passage, we see Paul addressing the Roman church, and he speaks of evil. The evil is not that of physical persecution, which will happen later, but rather the beginnings of social persecution by the Romans. Because they could not worship idols, the Christians were denigrated and despised. Today, we would call it bigotry. And we know that such bigotry eventually led to the horrors of Nero and Christians being torn apart, killed right and left. Bigotry always leads to violence. Bigotry is alive and well in our world today. The groups who are persecuted may change their names, but the evil remains the same. Bigotry leads to hate, and hate leads to violence. It's happening right here in America right now. There is an us versus them mentality everywhere you look, and the divisions are growing ever deeper and more dangerous, especially as we get closer to the election. The recent violence in Kenosha and all the chaos going on in some cities this weekend brings home the danger of our current divisions. People are suffering. The nation is suffering. Even before George Floyd, the rise in hate speech over the past few years has set the stage for violence. Bigotry feeds on fear and conspiracy theories and untruths. Bigotry loves to divide and diminish others. My cat Oliver agrees. He says amen. As with those early Christians who were despised at the beginning only to be fed to the lions later on, we know that hate always leads to violence, and we are seeing this unfold on our city streets today. Extremists on the right and on the left arming up, and that only leads to more violence, more fear, and more divisions. We find ourselves not only in a moral and political crisis, we find ourselves in a spiritual crisis too. Violence always begins with words, what we call hate speech. Now, in stark contrast to hate speech, the Apostle Paul's words in Romans are not dividing words, but healing words, uniting words, peaceful words, and more relevant than ever. Paul's exhortations to love one another with mutual affection and to live in harmony with one another leave no room for debate. Hate speech is wrong. Not only wrong, hate speech is evil. An expression of the ultimate disconnection of one human being from another, or from other groups of human beings. Hate in all of its forms is a failure to recognize the image of God in another. It impoverishes humanity. It defies the message of Christ. Hate speech is evil personified and made more despicable by adding Christian symbols. We have all seen images of burning crosses and God-fearing men and women dressed in ghostly white garb. Today, the KKK, emboldened as they are, they don't even bother to hide behind their hoods. Yes, evil, real evil, the kind that divides and diminishes others, is afoot in our world, and we need to do something about it. But what? What is the Christian response to such evil? That is the question Paul answers in this passage. The law of the land in Paul's day, and indeed in Jewish tradition, allowed a certain amount of retribution in these sorts of situations. Evil was not and is not to be left unanswered. However, rather than repay anyone evil for evil, though tempting, Paul exhorts us to take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. What is noble? I love that word. It's been lost, at least in our culture, but we need to bring it back. For what is noble in the sight of all. How might Christians act on these words? Well, silence is not the answer. We all know the quote attributed to Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Well, we know that peaceful protest is good, and 93% of the protests today are peaceful. But we have to vote. Voting is our greatest nonviolent weapon. But here Paul wants us to go to the spiritual aspects. He pushes his readers to get to the root of the thing, the root of evil, and root it out. But not with brute force, but with something even more powerful. The Reverend Dr. Amy Allen, a Lutheran pastor and New Testament scholar, captures the essence of Paul's message when she says, Christians are called not to ignore despair, but to help sow joy in its wake, not to condone hate, but to be all the more zealous in their own loving in its face. The politics of overcoming evil are about neither ignoring nor condoning evil, but rather fighting it with the strongest power possible, love. Dr. Martin Luther King said, hate cannot drive out love. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Of course, it's hard. It's hard in this world as it is now to see how love can drive out hate when hate is so well armed. Its very modus operandi is brute force, and it thrives on fear and chaos. How does love compete with that? And yet Paul insists in 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 that love is the more excellent way. Now, love as an ideal sounds really good to me, but let's be honest. Who feels like loving somebody whom you consider to embody evil? How many of us can really live up to that? We sometimes confuse love with feelings. There is no way I'm ever going to feel love for people who abuse children or animals or women. I can't possibly love Nazis or racist or political figures who embolden them or who denigrate those who have given their lives for our country. How are we to respond to such evil? With love. Not by taking up arms, as we are seeing the extremists do on both sides. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, says Gandhi. But feelings of love aren't what Paul is referring to here. He's talking about love with hands and feet and voice, action, all feelings aside. In verses 20 through 21 of today's passage, Paul goes so far as to say, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, the part about heaping burning coals on their heads, it reminds me of that Oscar Wilde quote that says, always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. But seriously, who can rise above that basic instinct of revenge? Thankfully, we have laws and a jurisprudence system to seek justice. But before laws comes the spiritual and moral awakening. That is, people recognizing the evils that exist and standing up for the good. Without women standing up for the right to vote, without people like John Lewis and Rosa Parks taking a stand during the Civil Rights Movement, amendments and laws could never have been passed. It all starts where the wounds are, where the spirit suffers, where the yearning for justice joins the discipline of peace and nonviolence. So, it's up to us as Christians and moral human beings to stand up against evil in all of its forms and do it in a nonviolent way, which means if we are to follow Paul's advice, we have to become inventive. This week, I was just stunned to discover a true story about a little town that is doing just that. living out this way of fighting evil with good in a really ingenious way. You see, the small town of Wunsiedel in northeast Bavaria, once the home to the grave of Adolf Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess, is a neo-Nazi destination. Yes, they have destinations too. And every year they show up to march, much to the consternation of the townfolk. But in 2014, the town came up with the idea of getting sponsors to donate money for each step marched by the neo-Nazis, kind of like a traditional walkathon. But in this case, the money earned by the Nazi walkathon goes not to the neo-Nazis, but to programs that actually fight the neo-Nazis, programs that help neo-Nazis defect safely. The neo-Nazis didn't know about it until they actually started their march, and they had no idea they would be walking against themselves. So the more steps the Nazis would take on their march through Wunsiedel, the more money they unwittingly raised to fight their own cause. There were even painted numbers on the route so that the neo-Nazi marchers would be forced to see how much money they'd collected at every milestone. Sponsors even made sure the Nazis had bananas and water on the route so they could walk even further, making even more money to defeat the Nazis. And at the end of their march, they received certificates reminding them of how much money they raised to fight Nazism. 10,000 euros, or close to $12,000. And it all went to Exit Deutschland, a group that helps neo-Nazis defect from the movement. It's ingenious. And other towns are now following their example. No violence, just plying the neo-Nazis with water and bananas so they can make more money to help defeat the evil of neo-Nazism. Like Paul said, if your enemies are thirsty, give them something to drink. If they're hungry, feed them. Paul is not commanding passive submission to the evils of this world, but rather commending a still more excellent way. If the little town of Wunsiedel can do it, so can we. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It is the more excellent way. Amen.